Thanks to everybody who has made it here. This is the first of what is going to be a sort of short series of talks over the autumn as part of CHERN. So if you're new to CHERN, this is the China and Europe Research Network. Started, I guess, around 6 years ago now. Originally, we had a grant to set up a kind of network, EU-funded network, which has grown to, I think, around 300 researchers at this point over about 40 countries. We're out of the grant period now, but given that sort of network that we've established, we're very keen to sort of preserve it and build upon this. And one aspect of that is the new working group, which I'm very happy to convene, on energy transition and resources. So CHERN traditionally has looked quite a lot at, obviously, issues of China, Chinese actors in Europe, and then vice versa, Europe in China. But we're also very keen to extend this a bit to sort of global questions, areas where China and Europe might sort of compete or have a complementary relationship, cooperate perhaps. One of which, of course, is energy, climate crisis, energy transition, all these sorts of issues. And that's why we wanted to start with a series of talks here. Very happy to have Paolo Gerbaudo, from Complutense University of Madrid, senior researcher there in political science and sociology, who has written a number of great books in the past, including The Great Recall with Verso. But these are sort of more of his recent work, which I became aware of from a really excellent article he has in Phenomenal World on this topic. But very much looking forward to hearing it, not in the flesh, but at least over Zoom, where I'll be talking about BYD and the Chinese electric vehicle industry. So with that, I will hand over to you, Paolo. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Nicholas, for introducing me, and Alexandra for organizing this. I'm very glad to be here and share some of my research on the Chinese EV sector and more broadly what has been described as the electric vehicle war, which is now a very significant industrial conflict, industrial development and conflict, which involves different nations and which is likely to have a very important influence on the economic and geopolitical future of our world. In the last years, Western countries, in particular, as the point of observation, have been taken by shock by the development of the Chinese EV sector. Really, it was since the end of 2023 that this alarm started ringing in Western capitals and in Western companies, but more prominently in 2024 and 2025, that has been this sort of panic about China's EVs. I mean, here in this slide, you see a number of headlines from the New York Times, The Economist, and the Financial Times, and other prominent Western, mostly kind of financial news media and economic news media that are really summarizing this level of shock, which in and of itself is really interesting, because it bespeaks the surprise from analysts, commentators, and including kind of qualified analysts about this phenomenon. How China built BYD, the Tesla killer, as it is described, China's electric vehicle dominance, China's EV onslaught. And what these different titles tend to summarize is the growth of China's EV sector, with one firm in particular at the center of all these, which is BYD, a firm that was established in the city of Shenzhen in southern China. So perhaps we can start from this shock, which is in fact one of several historical shocks and industrial shocks that have invested the automotive industry, with the most notable point of term of comparison being the famous Japanese shock which took place between the late 70s and beginning of the 1980s, when automotive firms from Japan, Toyota, and many more invested Western markets in the US and Europe with products that at the time were cheaper, significantly cheaper than their Western competitors, as well as better in many respects. They had higher quality because of high quality control. And interestingly, at the time, it is an interesting term of comparison, both economically, in a sense that it was a similar phase of competition from non-Western firms in the automotive sector, which until that point, Western firms, countries, and governments had considered their own preserve, both because of the centrality of the automotive industry, but also because of the sort of psychological element that is attached to automotive as an industry, which I think is also quite interesting politically, seen as a sort of flagship industry, where you want to celebrate your excellence. And at the time, the similarity with now was the fact that this onslaught of Japanese cars produced a protectionist response. Various countries started considering tariffs and introducing tariffs in order to respond to the competitiveness of Japanese cars, as well as trying to introduce other measures in order to protect their own national car industry. So we now find ourselves in a similar situation where in this new industry, because I mean, it's always automotive, but it is electric automotive, which is the novelty. There is a very strong competition coming from Chinese EV firms. I was recently at the car fair in Turin, Salone dell'Automobile, which is one of the main car fairs in Europe. And there you could find very prominently, a range of very different Chinese brands, Geely, SAIC Motor, BYD, and from BYD, two car models that are really smashing the European market at the moment, are having great commercial success, namely the BYD Seal and the BYD Dolphin, which are some of the most successful EV models that are around there in the market. And as we can see in this graph, there's been a momentous growth coming from these firms, in particular from BYD, which has famously overtaken Tesla in the last quarter of 2023, and since then has come on top, partly because of BYD's industrial effectiveness, competitiveness, low price, high quality combination, but also, as we know, because of Tesla's misfortune, which indeed BYD has tried to use as an opportunity to increase sales. So this is an industry where there's been a very significant growth in the number of overall vehicles that are sold, with China representing the main market worldwide, which accounts for over 50% of all EV sold around the world. So BYD has managed to both exploit its internal strength of the Chinese market as a very, very vast market for automotive, and one where EVs are growing considerably, but also to use China as a base in order to expand all over the world. So now in a more recent article that I published on Phenomenal World, while in the first one that Nicolas cited, I was looking really at the industrial strategy of BYD, what was new about it, a return of vertical integration, and other things that we discuss further in the presentation. The second article instead looked at the geopolitics and geoeconomics of BYD and the way in which it is very rapidly expanding beyond China, establishing very large factories in Southeast Asia, which is in a way the immediate foreign market for China because of geographical proximity is in a way China's backyard with a huge market given the size of countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. But also is expanding elsewhere, with Europe in particular being a very significant target for Chinese cars, with plants being established or in the process of being established, in particular in Hungary, which, as many in this room will know, as the lion's share of Chinese foreign investment in the EU, as well as in Turkey, with plants that are able to churn out 500,000 cars a year, which is a very large size for a car assembly plant, which bespeaks the level of ambition of this firm, which many predict the BYD from being a firm that was basically unknown to most people until 2004, 2005 really, could become, perhaps by the end of this decade or the beginning of the next, the new Toyota, namely the largest car firm in the world for all cars, regardless of whether they are internal combustion engines or EVs, also anticipating the fact that by 2030, regardless of the regulations from the EU or other states or quasi-states, at that point, basically all cars will be EVs. So this is really a momentous shift, both for China and for the world. And because for a long time, people associated China with the production of household goods, of clothes, of shoes, or the production of electronic components and the assembly of electronic devices and goods. But increasingly, they are facing the fact that China has managed to make the leap towards more high-tech production in electronics, but also has managed to make the leap in an industry where China didn't have a good reputation. I mean, Chinese cars were considered shoddy, unattractive, badly designed, and not a good offer or an appealing offer for Western markets. But they have managed instead to make this change, this transformation, and become very attractive products for Western markets as well. So the thesis that I'm putting forward, I mean, is that on the one hand, we have this accusation that the rise of the Chinese EV industry has been enabled by generous government subsidies. You know, we have all this discourse of overcapacity. We have all this discourse coming from the EU in particular, but also from the US, where basically this is not genuine, or this is not fair, because these firms have received very strong support from the Chinese government, and this government aid basically distorts the market. And of course, there is an element of truth in this, in the sense that, as we shall see, the Chinese automotive industry and its success is the result of a peculiar combination of entrepreneurial prowess and top-down governmental planning. But the way in which the government intervention has manifested itself are in many ways different from the sort of stereotypical image that is attached to government intervention, and they need to be understood in connection with profound changes in strategy and organization coming from firms themselves, including in particular a distinctive revival of vertical integration as an organizational strategy at both individual firm and national level. And on the other hand, we could add to this that in this accusation against Chinese EVs that they are relying on strong government intervention, there is a good degree of bad faith, in the sense that the developmentalism of the Chinese government has parallels most notably in the past, of course, of Western industry, but also in the present, of very strong collaboration and alliance between government and corporate interest that are often conveniently bracketed when we are talking about the Chinese economy. So what I'll try to give you in this presentation is two parts. One is BYD's strategy of vertical integration, why it is so important and why it is remarkable. Mainly because, as we shall see, it contrasts with the state of the art of management strategy in the automotive industry. And a second element that I should give you is how this fits with the Chinese strategy of national internalization or national integration. Namely, there is a firm level strategy of vertical integration, but this goes hand in hand with a strategy of self-reliance that has been strongly pushed by the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. So the theoretical basis for this comes from my recent work on statism and state interventionism. In this book published in 2021, I made the argument that we were moving away from neoliberalism and towards a neo-statism, namely a return of state interventionism visible at different levels, in a return of trade protectionism, in a return of industrial policy, in a growing geopolitical competition, especially pitting megastates such as the US and China one against the other, in the change in discourse, in the change in the key lexicon of contemporary politics, visible in the popularity of terms such as sovereignty, protection, control, security, that to me are quite novel in political discourse and clearly different from the mainstays of neoliberal discourse. And finally, and here we come a bit to the question of technology and the term techno-developmentalism that I've dropped in the subtitle for this presentation, how these all also concerns centrality of the battle for technology and technological supremacy as a tool for sovereignty. I mean, of course, in the modern era, and especially in the post-war period, big powers have competed for technological excellence and for technological supremacy. But my contention is that here we see an intensification of the centrality of technology, where technology and the control over technological systems is seen as, by and large, as the main battlefield determining who is winning and who is losing in great power competition. So let's begin with the first theme, that of vertical integration. I mean, vertical integration, when we are talking about vertical integration, of course, we think about Ford, the Ford automotive firm, and the way in which this firm integrated, namely brought together very different elements and components that are necessary to make a car. I mean, the reason why cars are seen in a way as a measure of a country's industrial development is the fact that they are extremely complex human products, which involve mechanics, electronics, chemistry, and many different input components and many different input industries. In order to make the automotive industry is the point of arrival for many other industries that are producing the basic components that then go into a car. That includes, of course, the engine and the various other mechanical parts, the wheels, the tires of the wheels, and the electronic elements, the lights of the car. I mean, we can just think about how many elements go into a car, but also think how cars are becoming more complex and technological in the present era, especially with EVs. To quote President Donald Trump when he did the test drive of a Tesla car on the lawn of the White House, in front of the White House, he famously said, "It's all computers." And now any car, any EV will have the standard big display screen that in a way has been made a standard precisely by Tesla cars. And this, again, tells us how much a car is the combination of very different technologies, all packed into one, and increasingly with information technologies being an important component of that. So with the example of Ford, has to do with the fact that the idea of vertical integration, namely of a business strategy that brings together under the same roof, under the same firm, very different operations, was introduced by Henry Ford. And that meant that the Ford Car Company acquired activities such as mines, such as steel making, such as the production of tires, including the primary materials that were necessary for making tires, in pieces of transportation and logistics that were necessary for the car. And some of the big industrial plants of Ford were really enormous factories where, starting from some very basic components, the different intermediate operations were realized until literally the final car would exit the building. So this is the idea of vertical integration, which is the idea of these gigantic firms that bring under their control all the different operations that are necessary to make something. And in so doing, they achieve an enormous power over the industry, over the economy, but also over society as a whole. Because of course, being so cutting across so many different activities, they employ many workers and they control many plants, but B, their management and economic decisions ultimately have consequences for all the different industries that are involved. So this is where the history of vertical integration. But the reason why we can speak of a return of vertical integration in the case of firms as BYD has to do with the fact that progressively many industries, including the automotive industries, have abandoned vertical integration by means of practices of outsourcing, offshoring, and so on and so forth, and externalization, as they are broadly described, these practices, where firms try to concentrate on the high profit activities, which mostly have to do with research and development and with the assembly of the car, while outsourcing all the other intermediate operations to other firms in order to retain for themselves the fattest piece of the pie, so to speak, while leaving the other pieces that are not as tasty, as it were, to other firms where often very high levels of exploitation and very fierce competition takes place. This is, for example, the history of, most notably, of the German automotive industry, where a lot of outsourcing has taken place, and where firms outsource to also to providers in other countries. In the case of the German car industry, famously, Italy, Poland, and Hungary are very important input countries for the German automotive industry, with Germany retaining, again, these high-value activities such as research and development and assembly of final cars. But it applies to many other firms in the automotive industry. It has, in a way, become the outsourcing mantra, the externalization mantra has become a default in the automotive industry, where firms try to get out of the firm all the activities that they didn't consider high profit and hence central to their strategy. What is happening instead with BYD is the contrary of this. Namely, this firm is notable in the way in which it controls spectacular number, a very considerable number of intermediate components and their production, which goes from the production and assembly of battery cells to the manufacturing of the electric powertrain, the manufacturing of semiconductors and electronic modules, but even very basic primary activities, such as the mining of lithium. So increasingly, the firm is also going into acquiring the very basic minerals that are essential for the production of a car, and also mechanical components such as cars, axles, transmission, cockpits, brakes, and suspensions, which are now by BYD all produced in-house, while typically other firms such as whatever Volkswagen or other German and non-German car firms would try as much as possible to outsource these components to external providers. According, for example, to a New York Times report that has looked at the value chain of the BYD Seal, which is the flagship model of BYD, which perhaps you are already seen driving around the UK or other European countries. People in this room maybe from. Certainly, I'm seeing a lot of these in Madrid and in Turin and other European cities. According to a New York Times report, 3/4 of components of the BYD Seal are produced internally, which is a very considerable amount, considering that most cars have much less than even half of components produced internally by the same firm. So one key element here of how and why this is happening is the history of the firm, is the history of BYD. Namely, BYD began not as a car firm, it began actually as a battery firm, as a firm that was focusing on the production of lithium batteries. The CEO of BYD, the founder of BYD, Wang Chuanfu, was a chemistry scientist, which at the time he began his PhD was quite an attractive branch of science compared, for example, to electronics or to computing or to computer engineering. But actually, his career developed in chemistry at a time when there was a very important development, namely the development of lithium batteries. So BYD began as a company that was producing batteries, including batteries for mobile phones, such as the Motorola or Nokia that the older people in the room will have used back in the 90s and early noughties. So well before then, lithium batteries became this general technology, which is now embedded in a great number of appliances and electrodomestics and electric products that we use in our everyday life, ranging from hoovers to electric bikes, for example, talking about the changing urban mobility that this has facilitated, of course, laptops and tablets, iPads and other tablets. I mean, in and of itself, the lithium battery as an invention and as a commercial development is enormously interesting because it has powered all these different appliances and devices and gadgets, going from the very small, such as smartphones, now going to the very, very big, including cars, including even trucks, excavators, especially as new modifications of these batteries are introduced or new technologies that are even more efficient are progressively rolled out. So Wang Chuanfu is interesting as a character, as an example of the new breed of Chinese entrepreneurs. There is an element of daring and of prowess, which in a way is similar to that of comparable entrepreneurs in the US, an element of dream as well as in the build your dream, which is the false, the spelling out of the acronym that has been attributed to BYD, in fact, post facto, including the fact that Wang Chuanfu moved from the battery industry into the automotive industry, partly, or at least so it is justified, because of the desire to realize his own original childhood dream, which was to build a car. And he did that actually quite in spite of shareholders of the firm, that when they discovered that Wang Chuanfu had acquired a failing state-owned car firm in order to do precisely that, to go into the automotive business, they were horrified. And the shares of BYD suffered because of that. Also because they had not been informed, duly informed in the quarterly report of this decision. So there is an element of visionary leadership, of imagination, of inventiveness, but there is also a very important element of state support. And while we may take the two to be incompatible and incoherent, as we are used to think that whatever capitalism is led by heroic entrepreneur figures such as those imagined by Ayn Rand in her books, while state planning and state intervention is the manifestation of a Soviet-style government, which is completely anachronistic and out of sync with present reality. China demonstrates that, in fact, these two logics can be reconciled, and they can be reconciled to support a model of capitalism which, in many respects, is proving superior to the late neoliberal model of Western economies. Another interesting element of BYD as a firm is just the sheer number of employees it has, which partly is a result of vertical integration, namely controlling so many aspects of the production of a car, of the value chain of a car. BYD has a number of employees, which in 2024 was between that of Toyota and Volkswagen, while producing a fraction of the cars produced by those two giants in the automotive industry. So there is an element also of, there is a bit of a contradiction in a sense that if we look at the participation of labor in the production, we see that human labor as a very important component in the case of BYD compared to similar firms. So in terms of so-called organic composition of capital, there is a very strong participation of labor vis-a-vis capital as expressed in machinery and plants and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there is a very rapid process of automation with many CEOs, reports from Western news media representing Western CEOs from Ford, General Motors, and other US and non-US car firm being taken by shock when they visit these plants where a very large number of operations are now completely automated, plants that are progressively resembling more these so-called dark plants of microchips production, namely plants where there is basically no human intervention whatsoever, except for supervision from a distant computer, from a distant observation point, with no intervention in the actual chain of production from human beings. Another element of integration that is also remarkable in the case of BYD is that now BYD is also entering the transportation of cars, acquiring so-called Ro-Ro ships, which are ships as the one represented in this slide, which are used precisely in order to transport car from one place to another. which has proven a competitive advantage for BYD because especially in delivery times and in terms of transportation. Why vertical integration can be advantageous for a firm? Because it ensures that the firm has a greater control over different aspects of its production and delivery of goods, including operations that on paper may look unprofitable, but in the large picture, in the big picture, ultimately are decisive. Because if you produce your cars and then you're not able to deliver them to internal or foreign markets, that obviously has knock-on effects on your global profitability. So the second element that I want to discuss here is how this fits into national industrial strategies. So an important element there is the famous Made in China 2025 strategy, which is part of a longer process or a longer strategy pursued by the Chinese government in order to achieve technological supremacy in a number of target sectors, as well as in order to achieve self-reliance in many of these sectors. Often the target that is quoted by Chinese policymakers is 80% of each and every component, input, or activity. Namely, they don't aim to achieve a 100% complete self-reliance, but they aim for a comfortable 80%, which would basically ensure that they are able to obtain the necessary components and inputs when they need it, without having to without the possibility that competitors, either in corporate competitors or other states, may be able to put pressure on specific bottlenecks in these value chains. So this is important because this tells us that one clear element of competitive advantage of Chinese EVs is that on the one hand, they have achieved a strong internal efficiency in these firms, partly thanks to their turn to vertical integration, but also that this is part of a broader national strategy, which ensures that these firms activities and inputs are concentrated, where they have their main market, their place of the site of production coincides with their main market, which continues to be China, which until now was the place where virtually the totality of Chinese EVs were sold, but also provides them a base from which they can export to other countries, in which they have, of course, an interest in increasing their sales. So these pictures gives us a very good sense of the relations of force and of the relative dimension of each market. If you look at the number of units of EVs sold in 2024, Asia accounts for roughly 2/3 or a bit less than 2/3 of global sales. The Asian market is 8 million vehicles per year, with Europe being the second market, 3.2, North America, 1.4. And this already gives us a very clear sense of why Chinese EVs are in such a strong position, because they are placed, not only they are producing the cars that are in many respects qualitatively superior and have very competitive prices, have the lowest prices, but they are also located in the country and in the continent that accounts for the vast majority of sales. So just some final considerations before closing the presentation. I think that the case of EVs is instructive from a very different number of perspectives. It tells us about a change in management strategy, about a change in technology that is extremely consequential. And it also tells us about how green capitalism has become the new battleground between capitalist blocs. I mean, in fact, China and recently Xi Jinping in recent declarations have made this green revolution, even almost officially, the goal of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. And this is coherent with the kind of industrial policy that they've been pushing. So the attempt here by China is to take advantage of the clear superiority in renewables and electric vehicles to achieve an even greater degree of industrial domination that they have achieved so far, exploiting the very cross-cutting character of automotive technology, the fact that automotive technology, to quote a famous expression, is an industry of industries. And therefore, if you control the automotive industry, you have levels of control over all the other industries. And in this context, there is a very interesting mix of entrepreneurialism and state planning, which I think is something that Western commentators, or at least those that are not au fait with contemporary China, are still missing, in which partly, this is something that I want to develop in future papers. What is interesting is precisely the way in which state industrial policy, state planning activities, state inducements of very different kinds, in the form of subsidy to consumers, subsidies to industries, provision of land, research and development, research funding, are designed to create something approximating to the famous competitive market situation, which, according to neoliberals, should be the spontaneous reality of capitalism, but which, in fact, from what we know from the history of capitalism, is not at all the normal reality of capitalism. So at least in the infancy stage of an industry, what China is trying to do is to create an almost artificial competitive pressure where there is a multitude of firms that are entering the market. In the case of China, we're talking about 90 EV firms that are competing, that are therefore engaged in this Darwinian competition, which ultimately produces a cutthroat struggle for efficiency and for low prices, as we're seeing now in the price war going on in China, which indeed in many respects can be seen as wasteful or overcapacity, but which ultimately produces extremely efficient national champions, which also end up being global champions, as it is the case with BYD and many other firms in the Chinese EV sector. So this is all. I hope that this was clear, and I look forward to your questions.